We're going to learn how to draw the area on the front of the torso between the ribcage and pelvis. There's the abdominal muscles, fibrous structures and fat and other components, but also there's the gesture connecting the ribcage and pelvis to think about. We'll look at how to draw all of that, the lines and shading to use and the characteristics to look out for, and we'll look at the differences between people with different physiques, all in less than 10 minutes. Hi, my name's Kenzo, and this is Love Life Drawing. So let's go through the general structure of things first. One of the most important things about the structure of this area is not the muscles themselves, but the skeletal structure around the muscles, especially the ribcage arch and the pelvis. And one of the most common mistakes we see is to elongate the torso by expanding the gap between these two big shapes. So try bending to one side and feel how close the bottom rib can get to the top of the pelvis. You know, I was an elongator for years, guys. Don't be an elongator. If you can get this gap right and the overall angles of these two structures, it's going to be much easier to get down the abs successfully. So what we generally think of when we say abs is the top part of this fairly vertical section of muscle called the rectus abdominis. So the rectus abdominis connects the ribcage to the pelvis. It attaches to the ribcage up here and the pelvis at the pubic bone down here. The grid-like appearance of the abs here is the most celebrated, so it's often prioritized in our drawings over more important things. We know it so well it's even got a nickname, the six-pack, and we tend to see and draw what our brains already recognize and then ignore or just get confused by areas that we haven't thought about much. But there are other characteristics of the midsection that are more important, so as artists we need to get just as familiar with those. Mako describes these muscles as a flexible bridge between the ribcage and pelvis, and as we always say, the relationship between the ribcage and pelvis is often central to the whole gesture, and these muscles, along with some fat, are the connection between them on the front. So look out for how they squash and fold and stretch. Often what really matters is the lines running across the ribcage arch and pelvis, and then the lines running down these abdominal muscles. There's the center line that runs down the middle of the rectus abdominis, which fades away below the belly button, but you can imagine it continuing and curving down to the crotch. And then there's the two sides of the rectus abdominis, which tapers off to the crotch as well. And then another prominent and visible muscle is the external obliques, which are basically on the sides, and the top part of them comes down diagonally from the ribcage towards the rectus abdominis. And usually they'll be quite subtle, but on really muscly people you might see they make this pattern like interlocking fingers with other muscles. But the thing to remember for now is just this general diagonal movement from these ribs to that central section of muscle, the rectus abdominis. The lower part of the external obliques are called the flank portion, and they attach to the lower ribs and go to the top of the pelvis at a slight diagonal, and they bulge out a little bit, pushing outwards from the bony bit of the pelvis, and they wrap a little way around to the back too. So these bits of muscle here, they're not talked about much, but they're important, especially because they're part of the silhouette of the figure. People do talk about the fat deposits here, they call them love handles, but not the muscle, and we really often see these little bulges at the flank portion ignored in drawings. So since things bulge out at the flanks and they're coming in from the ribs diagonally at the top, the point where things are narrowest is above the flanks, and when a pose is bent over, don't underestimate the sharp angles created there, how much the outline comes inwards before pushing outwards again. Getting these angles is often essential to the gesture. So before we continue, I just wanted to let you guys know that we have a free guide, a little booklet called Life Drawing Success. I think you'll like it. Check it out at lovelifedrawing.com/lifedrawingsuccess. Okay, it's six-pack time. The rectus abdominis has those tendinous, fibrous structures running across it, which create the distinctive indentations. They're often smoothed over by fat, but they are visible on lean people. And the one across the top is arch-shaped. The rectus abdominis overlaps the ribcage arch, So on a muscly person that's tensing up their abs, you might see that more curvy arch of the muscle instead of the pointy arch of the bony rib cage. Now the indentations going across the abs, they're often useful to help show the subtle roundness and volume of the tummy. And that's the same with any line or shape that runs around a volume. It's going to help you to represent that volume on your paper. I think it's often useful to think about a hierarchy of shapes, so what order you should see things in. So for example, in a figure drawing, generally it's good to look for big and simple shapes and prioritize those over small and detailed shapes. So here's a useful order to see things in. Look at the ribcage arch and the bony bits of the pelvis first. See the torso center line and the belly button. From there, look for the lines where the rectus abdominis meet the diagonal bits of the external obliques, and then how that rectus abdominis tapers down to the crotch. And then the diagonals of the obliques themselves as they wrap around the sides of the torso, which helps to give it volume. Look at the flanks that push out over the bony tips of the pelvis. Those are often overlooked. And also look out for any squashing, stretching, and folding, especially in the outline of the figure. Then, only after seeing all of that, look for the shadow shape that indicate the volume of the abs themselves. All the time, feel the movement or gesture that runs through these lines. So we need lines and shading that emphasize the big important things and are more subtle with the details. Because otherwise, things like that grid that we talked about can start to dominate the drawing. If the whole area is in light or is in dark, then keep the contrast within that area low. Keep the contrast for the details low. You know, the indentations, they're noticeable often, but they're not necessarily really deep and really important. Instead, look to emphasize the bigger shadow shapes that explain the bigger volumes. Then these little detail features are secondary to all of that. So here, some bits are a little bit lighter than others, but in general, it's all in the light range. Or here, some bits are a bit darker than others, but in general, it's all in the dark area. If the abs are in light and you want to bring more volume to them without getting too harsh in the shading, consider some white pastel or something to help add volume. If the light is falling in a way where there are strong form shadows around individual abs, then you can have stronger contrast, but use it to bring out the bigger shape and just indicate that grid-like structure. You can merge shadow shapes around the sides of the abs or around the bigger shape of the abs. So you can give some indications of those indentations in those shapes rather than trying to clearly define each square, and just try to merge the shadows as much as you can. So six-pack abs are very rare, and usually some or all of those indentations across the abs are smoothed over. Generally though, you can see the bigger shapes that we talked about. Even when someone has more fat tissue covering the abs, you can still see the center line, some diagonal movement down from the ribs and where they meet that central column of the rectus abdominis. Fat is going to deposit differently on different people, but often there'll be more around those flanks on the sides that we talked about, and in a rounded shape just below the belly button too. Female people will often have a narrower rib cage and wider pelvis, which means different shaped abs to males. Sometimes the rectus abdominis can take on a violin shape, but that's really a rough generalization. And again, if you're drawing someone, it's best to observe their abs rather than thinking about those generalizations. So generally in profile, the abs push forward beyond those bony bits of the pelvis, even on slim people. This area in profile does vary a lot though, depending on whether the person's sucking in their stomach or tensing up their muscles or even just breathing in or out. Generally, even on a slim person, there's some outward curve below the belly button. Keep in mind that since we are basically big bags of water, our outlines tend to bulge outwards in convex curves. So at the waist, even as things come inwards overall, the curves coming in and then going out again, they're still convex. Okay, so as always, watching a tutorial like this is just the start. The skills need to be practiced to take hold, and that practice is likely to start off kind of confusing and frustrating. It's just always like that. But persevere and all becomes clear. So there's more videos on the screen, guys. Check them out, and I'll see you next time.